Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Quiet Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick DePeters. Today, I have a special guest named Brad Hermann. He is someone that has become my executive coaching client, and we've since become friends over this past 6 months or so. But in addition to me being sort of supremely impressed by Brad's, life philosophy and his approach to leadership and to personal growth, but I also have been very inspired with his journey of late following really horrific car accident that left him in really bad shape, which is the least I could say of the situation. But from that experience, Brad had a number of insights and lessons that I thought would be really interesting to share with our audience because he's very much a quiet leader and I think matches the overall mission of this podcast. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Brad to the show. Brad, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Patrick. Great to be here with you.
So, Brad, why don't we kind of orient the conversation around your background? Actually, I don't know for sure that you're from Missouri, but I want to know about your kind of like, where are you and what does your upbringing sort of look like in terms of your most kind of important memories?
Yeah, so I'm from St. Louis, born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, and actually live in St. Louis now. Took a detour through Denver for 6.5 years and Milwaukee for 2 years through my career journey. But yeah, grew up, born and raised here, middle class family. Father was a police officer, mother was a nurse. And, that really shaped a lot of how I think and just the way I was brought up. My parents never had a lot of money, but they both, lived a career that was all about service. My dad is a police officer and a first responder. My mom is a nurse for almost 40 years and, focused on her patients and just learned a lot through them throughout my life. And so, yeah, I grew up a baseball player, wanted to play Major League Baseball. That didn't quite pan out, but did find a way to stay in the baseball industry, which I'm sure we'll get into in my current role at Rawlings.
Awesome. So, learning that your parents were essentially, in a way, public servants. People don't, and nurses are not necessarily considered public servants, but in a way they are, right? Like we talked a little bit about, and I think it's fairly well known that like nurses don't always get compensated fairly enough or get recognized for like the kind of amazing work, amazing life-saving work they do day in and day out. And yet, our society sometimes overlooks that. And so growing up with a mother who was a nurse, and we'll speak about your father after, but growing up with a mother who was a nurse, like what did you learn about service and leadership by observing your mom working in that field?
Yeah, I watched my mom. She was always very focused on her patients, and she a lot of times felt like some of the policies and things that were done at the higher level at her hospital wasn't always focused on patient care. So she was always focused on giving her patients the best care she could. She worked in several different areas. Her longest stint was in the GI area, which no one's ever happy to see anyone in the GI area. But, she really was always focused. Her patients were always what was most important. It was never about her. And, watching her over these past few years, she's had a lot of back and spine and neck injuries. She's had a lot of surgeries. My mom's not a big woman. She's about 5'2" maybe. And I think, a lot of having to move patients around and everything she had to do through her career took a toll on her body. But she was willing to make that sacrifice to serve others. And I'll tell you, I've always respected my mom and nurses, but when we dive into my experience over the last 4 months, my respect for nurses has grown exponentially, having to be served by nurses, for a period of time when I was in the hospital.
Yeah, we will definitely dive into that. And I think, as you mentioned, your father being, is it state trooper or
State trooper, yeah.
State trooper? Okay. So your father being a state trooper, that's another component of a professional that you encountered this summer, right? Like someone who's a state trooper coming to help you in your time of need in many ways. But is there anything else you want to share about his experience and how that might have compared or contrasted with your mother's?
Yeah, his experience was, he was always literally putting his life on the line. He spent many years of his career actually on the highway, working to, pull people over if they were, DWI or speeding or all those things. And, every time you pull someone over, you don't know exactly what you're going to get, and there was some times and some stories that he didn't share with me when I was growing up, but he shared with me later in life where his life was on the line. And I know my mom was always very scared. And eventually he was able to get promoted and moved into more of a desk type role. I know that made my mom very, very happy when he was able to kind of get off the road. But, he saw a lot of things and yeah, you touched on it as well. I had my parents and their jobs and what they did for a living has really come full circle for me over the last few months, and how much, those professions really serve others. I've always known that, but now that I've actually been the one being served, it definitely changes your philosophy even more.
Mhm. I'm wondering if, as I think about a police officer and a nurse as one's parents, in this case, your parents, I'm wondering how that, impacted your philosophy on dealing with people, right? Because it's a very people centric jobs, police officer and nurse, and they often are in circumstances that, as you sort of alluded to, whether it's on the highway and there's sort of personal risk, right, to yourself, or it's in the ER and you're exposed to all sorts of traumas and different things that could take a toll. So I'm wondering how the combination of those two experiences, like coming home every day from those kinds of environments, made you make certain types of, assessments or sort of perspective on dealing with people and also on dealing with, the uncertainties that come with one's workplace like that.
Yeah, my dad was always very, very outgoing, and I picked up a lot of those attributes from him. I have kind of an outgoing personality, then picked up a lot of, his characteristics and how he deals with people. I also always felt my dad was a really great leader, and he could be very tough. As a dad growing up, having a dad as a police officer is not the easiest thing. But yeah, I learned so much from them. And a lot of what I learned is I didn't really recognize in the moment as much as I've recognized later in life. I don't think I appreciated how much they really sacrificed to serve others when I was growing up. When you're growing up and you're in your teens, you end up being pretty selfish, right? So I wasn't always focused on service and serving others. But when I got older and was able to reflect on their lives and what they did and what they experienced, it made me want to serve others. So, a lot of my life has been about service. Hasn't always been about service. I wasn't always focused on service in my teens and high school and even probably college. But later in life, I was able to really reflect on how much my parents devoted their life to serving others and wanted to do the same. And in a different way, my job, I do believe, serves others. It's not quite the same. I'm not putting my life at risk in my job or my health at risk in my job. So it's not quite the same level of service that a police officer and a nurse bring to the table. But I do think there's ways to serve others in the business world and to, serve those who you work with day in and day out, those who report to you and those you just interact with each day. There's a way to be a servant leader, when you're in the business world as well. And so I think, that's always been kind of my natural inclination to be a servant leader and try to put others before myself. I don't always do that, but I try to live that way.
I love that. And we're, we're going to talk a little bit about more of the business world, your experience kind of in the business world later. But I think before we do, I'd love to explore you now working at a baseball kind of sporting goods company, Rawlings, which is, I'll let you tell us about kind of how significant Rawlings is relative to the sport of baseball. But many people could probably guess, certainly in the United States, that it's an incredible storied brand that you were able to join as a professional. Maybe not on the diamond anymore as an aspiring MLB player, but there are very few people I've met that have been able to transition a passion like a sport, for example, to then working in the business world where you're at like the holy grail of a brand for that sport. So would love to learn more about your journey to Rawlings and what it means to you to work at a company that you probably used to have a mid as a kid, from that very company.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. When I started my career, I worked for a company named May Company, which was a Fortune 100 company that ended up getting bought by Macy's. And I worked in tabletop. So I was a frames and silver assistant buyer, eventually ended up as a China buyer, and was 25 years old and picking out plates with butterflies and flowers on them. So I was way out of my swim lane. It did okay. I certainly wasn't tied to the product. So if a product didn't sell, it was out, So I did okay, but I knew long-term that wasn't where I wanted to be. And so when May Company went away, I ended up joining the Sports Authority out in Denver, Colorado. And I started my career there in licensed sports, and I worked in NBA and NHL and NCAA. And I was like, yes, this is great. This is where I want to be. So there's a long transition that got me to Rawlings, but now been at Rawlings for almost 10 years. And it's been an exciting journey. We have thrived as a company. When I first got to Rawlings, the company was not doing well. It was a sub 5% EBITDA company and was really, really struggling in a lot of ways. And we got a new CEO who started right around the time I did, and he really turned the company around. And we started putting up some good numbers, record year after record year after record year. COVID hurt us, obviously, when kids weren't out playing. But we were able to, right after COVID, acquire the brand Easton. And now we are by far the largest hard goods baseball and softball company in the world. And the company's doing very, very well. It's a great organization. It has a great culture. Very ingrained in the game of baseball. For anyone who watched the World Series last night, you saw probably 50 to 60% of the players wearing a Rawlings glove. You saw every baseball that was played with was a Rawlings baseball. Every helmet that was worn was a Rawlings helmet. All the bases are Rawlings bases. So, very tied into the major league game, but also tied in obviously at every level of the sport.
What can you share about the history of Rawlings?
Yeah, it's been around since 1887. Doak Rawlings actually created the first webbed mitt. So we have we just opened a store actually in St. Louis. So if you ever get a chance and you're in St. Louis, it's in the Westport Plaza area. Very, very cool store we opened, just half store, half museum. And we have some of the old gloves, and you can see what a glove looked like in 1887. Quite a bit different than they look today. So we were able to grow with the sport, through time. We at one point were in boxing and in all kinds of tennis and bowling and all kinds of stuff, football. And really, it's been in the last 10 years that we've really narrowed our focus to be primarily with a couple side businesses, but mostly baseball and softball focused. So, yeah, great American company. we do obviously outsource some products, but we are American based. We employ quite a lot of people here in America, in St. Louis, in California, in Minnesota, and Tennessee. I mean, we've got factories all over the country, and so it's an iconic American brand. It really is, and that's a responsibility that us on the executive team take very, very seriously, to grow that brand and to make sure the brand far outlasts any of us.
I think actually, this is a question for you. Do you know when the first baseball game was played? Or approximately, like the founding of baseball?
I don't. I probably should, but definitely prior to 1887. So,
Yeah.
but
Just pretty interesting.
Baseball's been around forever. Obviously, it's the American pastime, and it's been ingrained in American culture, for hundreds of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, funny enough, I don't know if I shared this with you, but the founder of my high school was photographed in what is said to be, and I don't have a tons of proof on this, but I'm pretty sure it's well known, the first photograph of a live baseball game ever.
Okay.
He's in it. And I don't know the exact dates, but the school was founded in 1850. So I was trying to get some sense as to
Okay.
where that might fall in and whether or not a Rawlings might have been in that game. But in any case, I'm curious as well whether or not the Rawlings family has still any kind of involvement with the company.
Not to my knowledge. No, I've never met anyone
Oh.
from the Rawlings family. Jim Easton from the Easton brand was quite involved up until, I'm not even sure the last date. We acquired Easton in 2020, but yeah, I'm not sure of all the Rawlings family history in the brand. So I got some homework to do. First baseball game.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on. Yeah, it's just really interesting when you think about these storied brands, particularly in the US, because a lot of the names are, not that old in terms of their involvement. But like the Walt Disney Company, for example, the Disney family has been involved for a long time, and there's quite a few kind of storied brands, less longevity, I suppose, but the Ferrari family, you sort of name it, and I think Johnson Johnson, like there's just tons of brands that have real families behind them, and I think it's kind of interesting to learn whether or not they still see their stewardship of their brand as something that they actively want to be involved in. All right, so let's get to the really, really sort of significant piece of your journey, certainly in the last year and maybe in your life. But why don't you take us back to mid-June?
Yeah. So I was actually on my way to, it was a Friday afternoon. I was on my way to pick up my son from day camp. Thank God I was on my way to get him and he wasn't in the car. The light turned green. I was literally half a mile from my house, and the light turned green for me to go across. It's, 3-lane highway on both sides, and a cement truck ran a red light pretty badly and T-boned me, knocked me unconscious, pushed me 500 feet. And yeah, I had a lot of severe injuries. I actually came back to consciousness by one of the first responders who was knocking on my window, and thank God for that guy. And we'll talk about him in a little bit, but they, those first responders really focused on keeping me awake because I was in complete shock. They estimate that the truck pushed at least a foot, if not 2 foot intrusion into my car. I know you have some pictures maybe you'll share later, but the car was completely smashed. They ended up having to cut off both doors and the roof to get me out. I was so smashed into the car. I was immediately taken out of the car. When I got out of the car, I remember thinking, okay, let's see, what you can move. And I could move my right leg pretty well, but I could not move my left at all. My left leg was severely trapped. as was my pelvis was severely trapped by both the pushing in of the car as well as the seatbelt and pushed against the center console. So my pelvis had severe injuries. I was rushed to the ER where they immediately put me into surgery. I had severe internal bleeding. They removed my spleen and they had to put a bunch of packing in me to try to stop that bleeding. I ended up with 10 broken ribs, a broken left shoulder. My pelvis was broken in 3 spots. My bladder was shattered. I had 3 severe blood clots in my left leg and nerve damage in my left foot. I'm probably leaving out something, but the piece that you won't hear, by the grace of God, is no spine injury and no brain injury, which is amazing. I did spend 5 days on a ventilator. I don't remember the first 9 days or so after the accident, because when I came off the ventilator, I had severe delirium. I didn't know where I was. And my wife's got some funny stories of things that I said during that time that I don't remember. But was able to come to, spent 11 days in the ICU, spent 34 technically days in the hospital and in inpatient rehab, and finally came home in late July after the accident. But it's been a crazy road. It's been a painful recovery and slow recovery. I'm still struggling in some ways, but I'm getting stronger every day. And I'm, just blessed, honestly, by the grace of God, to be here, as not many people get T-boned by a cement truck going 50 miles an hour and live to tell about it. So while I don't want to go through it again, I am grateful, to be here and to be able to still be with my family and still, live hopefully a long, healthy life.
Thanks for sharing that. I know probably just talking about it, I'm sure is difficult to kind of think through and take inventory of just, how awful it all was. With the number of injuries, as you said, I think you've shared with me even more than that list. And so it's a pretty unfathomable sort of experience that left you, bedridden and, probably confused, and later every other type of feeling you can imagine, I'm sure. But I'd like to go back to the moment of impact, so to speak. Actually, just before that. So you were heading your son. I think you would share with me, you don't have to share specifics, but you were like in our work together. And as you've been sort of progressing through your career, like things were on the up and up, right? Like you were making progress in so many different dimensions, not just at Rawlings, but there were a number of other kind of things that were getting you going, your nonprofit activities, et cetera. So that was a sort of average summer morning, and you're feeling pretty good, right? And then the unexpected happens. Take us back to like your last, let's say, memory before the impact.
Yeah, my wife actually had some coworkers over. We put in a pool last year at in-ground swimming pool, and she had some friends over to go swimming. And she was actually supposed to pick up my son. And, I felt like she was having some friends over, so I could just go get him. It was a quick, 2 minutes away, no problem. So, I was in a really great spot. I mean, you and I have talked about, I spent 2024. My goal this year was to have my best health year of my life, which is kind of an ironic goal after, what happened. But I'd done 75 hard to start the year. And then I had run a marathon in California in late April. And I was in pretty close to the best shape of my life, which honestly helped me tremendously in the recovery. But I was in really great shape. Finances were really good. Had some things happening at Rawlings that were going to be lucrative for me. And also my nonprofit work was going really well. My kids were healthy. My wife was in really great shape because we had done 75 hard together. And yeah, it just kind of felt like life was going really, really great, and you kind of feel like you've got your life where you want it, and you feel like you're in control a little bit. And then quickly the universe, God, whatever you want to believe, showed me I wasn't. And so, yeah, and that was tough, man. And I woke up in the hospital and finally was able to come back to. It was like, man, like I didn't do anything wrong. Like I was going to pick up my son and this guy blew a red light, and so it was a battle it was a physical battle, but it was way more a mental battle these last 4 months, and still is, honestly, a mental battle.
That makes perfect sense. I think we'll dive into the ongoing battle, the mental versus physical, and I think that's a super interesting area that we'll explore together. And I'm wondering if you remember like the first things either if you remember or you actually said following the accident.
Yeah, so the first things I said was call my wife. You got to call my wife, because my first thought was solely about my son and going to pick up my son. And I knew she wouldn't know I got in the accident unless, somebody told her. So I kept yelling out my wife's phone number. One of the firefighters joked he felt like he had it memorized.
He's 50.
And I kept asking them to call her. And obviously they were busy cutting the car open and trying to get me out of the car. And when they got me into the ambulance on the gurney, they said, I kept saying, call my wife, call my wife, call my wife. And I remember one of the EMTs said, we're going to call your wife, but we have to save your life first. And that was like, wow, I could die. And that was powerful. And they finally did call my wife. And I remember hearing the EMT say, your husband's been involved in a bad car accident. And they started talking to her. And that's the last thing I remember. That's the last thing I remember. It's kind of like my body had all this adrenaline, making sure my son was taken care of, making sure my wife knew what had happened, and, somebody would go get Lucas. That once I knew that was going to happen, it's like my body just let go and kind of fell into the injury and shut down.
I think that says, just hearing that story, I think it's really so interesting, right? To have your first words be about picking up your son from soccer, who's like, presumably not going to be left there by whoever the coach is or whatever, and yet that was your first thought in addition to calling your wife. I find that super interesting. It's just like this instinctual, deep love and really kind of service I'm sure you must have felt, and you are as a father, right? So I found that to be inspiring and sort of, I guess, heartwarming kind of thing that came out of those first moments. So, all right, so you get to the hospital and you said you don't remember, I guess, the first 9 days. What happened on day, let's say 10, when you kind of came to and realized the precarious and tragic sort of circumstances that you now found yourself?
Yeah, it was, just trying to figure out where I was and what was going on. I had this, what they called an external fixation on my pelvis, which the easiest way to explain that is, think about halos that someone wears when they break their neck. I had something like that on my pelvis, which normally they would have fixed the pelvis from within, but I had a leak in my bladder, pretty bad one, my bladder being torn apart. And so they had to figure out how to fix it externally, which the ortho surgeon said was a major challenge. And he had to call quite a few people to figure out how to do that. But kudos to him for figuring that out. But it was definitely, kind of the biggest, not the curse, but mind F you can imagine, just trying to figure out, where am I? How did I get here? Even when I started to come to, I kept telling him, Amanda, I'm ready to go home. She's like, yeah, you're not going home. So the first, I don't know, 3-4 days when I came back to, I really didn't sleep at all. I was in the ICU for a couple of those days, and I moved into a step down unit, and yeah, I couldn't sleep, and I was just in a mental fight with myself. For anybody who's familiar with the Bible, there's the book of Job, where Job is a guy who's got life by the, by the tail, and he's got everything. And then all of a sudden everything's taken away from him. And that's how I felt. And I ended up, I told you the story in one of our coaching sessions. I ended up saying, hey, I need to speak to somebody. It was at a Catholic hospital, and they said they had a 24-hour chaplain. And so one night at like 4 a.m, I said, I got to talk to somebody. And they said that they would try to find a chaplain that night. They couldn't find one that night, but he came and talked to me in the morning, and him and I had an amazing conversation that I really, really wish I had recorded. But we talked for like 2 hours, and his name's Father Joseph. He's from Nigeria. Amazing, amazing man. I mean, only God could connect a man from Nigeria in St. Louis, Missouri with me. But we had a great conversation and just got into a lot of specifics just around, how I felt. And he really allowed me to open up and talk about it, but also kind of challenged me like, okay, like, what are you going to do about it? Like how are you going to get out of this headspace, and really forced me to think about things. We had a lot of deep religious and spiritual conversations that greatly helped me push through. But, after that conversation, he left after about 2 hours of us talking, and I hadn't barely slept in 4 days, and I immediately fell asleep after he left. And I had really bad PTSD. Like, I did not want to close my eyes when I woke up because I was afraid they wouldn't open again. But after talking to him, that fear went away, which was amazing. And don't get me wrong, I still had some really, really tough nights in the hospital, but I didn't have that same level of fear and PTSD and just seeing the accident like I did before I talked to him.
How did you, well, let's start with the headspace you were in before the conversation started with the chaplain. How were you feel? Like, obviously there was something sort of bubbling up in terms of like, you really need to speak to someone. What was the primary kind of thought? Or was it a basket of thoughts all over the place? And I guess feelings might be the better word.
Yeah, it was just trying to process, and I just couldn't feel like I could process what had happened to me. It was just such a crazy experience, and just, I couldn't move. And this thing on my pelvis, I couldn't sleep. I had to sleep on my back like this. I couldn't roll over at all. I couldn't move. And when they'd come to, they'd have to roll me like every couple hours so I wouldn't get bed sores. And they'd ask me to reach over and grab, and I couldn't do it. And, that was just unbelievable, right? I had just run a marathon, and now I can't even roll over. I can't do anything for myself. And that was really, really, really tough. But what was so important was to shift. Like, what I found this whole time is like just shifting your mindset from negativity. And this is true, and not just in something, as dramatic as what we're talking about, but just in your day to day, just trying to get yourself out of that negative mindset that we all go through, right? And keeping it positive. And when I was able to spin back to my kids, back to I'm alive, I could easily be dead, and probably should in a lot of ways. When I was able to spin it back to gratitude, and spin it back to family, and spin it back to, focusing on things other than myself, I was able to keep going, and that was the key through the whole thing, was just keep going, keep going. It's going to get better. It might get worse before it gets better. And multiple doctors told me that, because I had 6 or 7 surgeries that just kind of kept happening, and the bladder ones were terrible. And, so sometimes things had to get worse before they got better, but eventually they would get better, and they did, and they are. So if I could, touch on anything for your audience, Patrick, it's definitely, it is a powerful, powerful force, and it can get you out of some dark times and some dark mindsets if you can focus on things you're grateful for. And even the person who has it really, really bad in life has something they can be grateful for, right? So, the more you can focus on that, the better you're going to be.
Love that. You're not the first guest to mention gratitude in terms of getting through hard times or getting out of a funk or, negative thought loops or whatever it is. Gratitude can really throttle that, if not put the brakes on it entirely, at least for a time. And it can change your state and it can change your perspective. So I think I agree with you. I think gratitude is exceptionally powerful. What was it, if you had to, as you're starting to make sense of at least where you're at, maybe, I don't know to the extent you struggled with the why of it all, but if you did, you could certainly speak to that. But as you're coming to terms with your reality, following the accident and, the outlook for life, your physicality, your fitness, any number of things sort of at stake, what was like the big overarching lesson that you took out of, you started to kind of conclude, let's say?
Yeah, I started to try to make it like almost like a game, like a competition, like 75 hard. Like I was so grateful that I had done 75 hard, especially, the marathon too, for sure. But I'd run marathons before, and it's not the same level of mental toughness that 75 hard required. Plus, I read a lot of stuff on mental toughness while on 75 hard. The mental toughness is huge. There's so much focus these days on mental health and things that, really didn't exist when I was growing up. That's so important. And mental strength is critical. So, I tried to turn it into a competition, and like each day I tried to move forward a little more, and I started writing out goals for myself. Like my goal today is to roll over. My goals were pathetic and made sure at the time they wouldn't be an impressive list if you read them, that's for sure. But they helped me, and it helped me to have those goals, to try to read. For me, getting communion from the chaplain every day was important, and talking through faith and praying with him was important for me. But just trying to view it as, okay, like I'm not going to get healed tomorrow. I'm not walking out of here tomorrow, but I can get a little better every day. And, how do I set goals to help me do that? And I actually have a list it's over here on my desk, actually, of all the original dates that I wrote out. I started writing out dates of when I would have conversations around what was expected, right? And if they said, hey, you're probably going to be able to walk again in 4 months. Okay, 2 months, Like I would cut in half whatever they said, and you know what? I put down a list of goals, and for the most part, I've hit or exceeded all of them. And I think that was really, really important for me, for my mindset, to focus on those goals. And I think that's what gets a lot of people. And trust me, I had my own experience there too, where you just lean into the pain and all you can think about is the pain, and I don't deserve this. And I was only trying to go get my son. I had all those thoughts, don't get me wrong, but I worked very, very hard not to stay in that space and to stay goal oriented, and Amanda helped me. My wife helped me tremendously. I should be talking a lot more about her in this podcast, because she was just absolutely tremendous, just a rock for our entire family. There was days where I would get woe is me and, had a really hard time kind of even picking my head up, and she would lift me. So without her, I wouldn't have made it either. She was huge. If you had to list like, top few reasons, she's number one. Her love, her support, her strength. She never really looked at me like, oh man, look at how bad you look. Or I'm like, I can't believe you're in this spot. She was never like that. It was always like, you're getting better. Hey, things are getting better. You're moving, and was always positive and pushing me forward. And that was huge for sure.
Love that. No, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think having that kind of support, certainly as your spouse and your, really the first words you said to the EMTs, as you mentioned, were, call my wife, and having that kind of partnership through some dark days and support and love and care is something that I can imagine was tremendously helpful.
And one of the best outcomes of this whole ordeal is our marriage is stronger than it's ever been. Our love for each other is stronger than it's ever been. I mean, she showed me what true unconditional love looks like. And I'll never forget it, I love my wife more than anything. But my love for her has grown 10x, 100x, through this whole ordeal. So I learned a lot about marriage and about love and support. And yeah, that was one of the blessings of this accident.
Love that. I love that. Yeah, I can imagine. And how long have you been married?
16 years.
Wow. Sort of the growth mindset in the format of love, right? In a way. So one thing that occurred to me, how long was it that you were actually in the hospital, like total, approximately?
34 days.
34 days. Okay. And then you were bedridden for how long, including like being at home?
Shoot, I really couldn't like, and it's bedridden, it's like I could get up sometimes with a walker and stuff. So I really couldn't fully like walk and use my left leg until like September, like early September. So I wasn't necessarily fully bedridden, but I kind of was, I wasn't getting out, going anywhere. I was on home health. So I had nurses and physical therapists coming to the house. And, part of being on home health is you're not allowed to leave the house except for appointments. So I was on home health until sometime in September. Amanda would probably remember the date a little bit better than me, but it was sometime in September. So a long time, the June 14th was the accident. So, almost 3 months was pretty much stuck to home for the most part.
Yeah, I asked because it occurred to me that you were essentially, limited in many ways from the accident, physically, emotionally, and certainly confined in ways that you didn't want to be confined for about, let's call it 75 days. So
yeah.
I think it's interesting. It'd be interesting to hear from you as to how the first 75 hard, as it's branded, compared and contrasted to the second, right? The first is obviously optional in a way, and your physicality is significantly contributing to your mental strength. And it's kind of both your physicality and your mental strength are sort of going together in a way. But you might say it's initiated by your mental strength to even start the program, and certainly to keep in it. But at a certain point, you start developing a habit that makes it a little bit easier. But in the second version of your 75 hard, things were very different, right? So wanted to know if you had any kind of reflections on those very difficult sort of, personal challenges that you had, one being optional and one that wasn't.
Yeah, I thought 75 hard was really hard until I went through the second round. So I mean, yeah, the 75 hard, the first round, the actual program itself gave me so much mental clarity. That was to me the greatest outcome of the program. Was I don't think I'd ever thought as clear as I thought during those 75 days. I definitely was not mentally clear during the second 75 hard. I was on a lot of medication and drugs and, you name it, muscle relaxers, oxy, all that stuff. So my mental clarity wasn't there. I did try to develop good habits. Like I tried to make sure I would read every day. I tried to make sure I would do the exercises I could do, or what I was supposed to be doing every day as best I could. So I did try to do those things. I tried to have some time with my children every day. We talked about in one of our coaching sessions, actually, one of the hardest parts of the whole ordeal was actually coming home. People think, oh, it's great, you're at home, you're in your own bed, and, things are much easier. And yeah, there's some truth to that. And there's definitely some comforts of being home. But I hated being home and feeling like a burden. I would see my wife having to run the kids around to their different events. I would see her trying to, cook dinner and get them moving to bed and all these things. And I couldn't help at all. And that, not only could I not help, I was adding to her burdens because I needed to be helped. I needed to be served. And that was hard. That was really hard for me. I mean, honestly, the first few days I was home, I never said this out loud necessarily, but in my own head, I was like, I'd rather be back in the hospital, because at least there I wasn't a burden. And, my kid could come see me for an hour or two in the hospital and I could fake it that, I wasn't in tremendous pain, but when they saw me at home, they had to see it. They had to see it when I had to go to the bathroom or I had to get up. They had to see me try to move a catheter bag around. They had to see this horrible thing on my pelvis, this external fixation. And, they had to help serve me. That was weird too. Be served by your children. That's not the way it's supposed to be, or at least not the way it was supposed to be in my mind. And so that was a major challenge, of the second 75 hard, if you want to call it that. Probably the hardest part was when I came home, which is kind of mid range of those 75 days.
And then something shifted at home. I can imagine, being closer to your, being less busy at work, being truly present, even if that wasn't in the ways that you wanted to while you're home. But you had more time with those people. And I'm wondering what changed there. You mentioned you have 2 kids, you have your wife who's running around, keeping it all together. How did how did your relationship with those people change? Or your family, I guess.
Honestly, there's a list of blessings that came out of this whole ordeal. And one of them is having the time to spend with my children. I was a very busy person. I felt like I'm coaching their teams, right? I'm spending time with them, but there'd be times where I'd be down here a lot at night. I finished my MBA about a year ago, and they'd come down to tell me about their day or to do something. And to be honest, I'd talk to them, but I kind of was, I don't want to say wanted them to go away, but kind of, not the most conducive, great father, right? Just was, and a lot of times where I'd spend time with them, I wasn't mentally there. I was focused on work or something else, right? That wasn't giving time to them. And I remember my son had a lot of activities during the summer. He was at a bunch of summer camps and stuff, but my daughter didn't. My daughter's 12, my son's 9. And my daughter was home a lot and I was home, and I didn't really have anything to do, right? I wasn't working. I couldn't move for the most part. And so she would just come in and lay with me. And we had a lot of really, really great conversations. And I felt like I got to know her in a way I wouldn't have otherwise, because I wouldn't have let myself slow down. I wouldn't have laid in bed like that, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? With my daughter. we watched a lot of the Olympics together, which was really cool. So I'm grateful for that time. That's time I'll never forget. It certainly wasn't the time I had planned to spend with my kids during the summer, but it was great, especially with my daughter, because she understood more of what was happening than my son, just because she was older. And she really wanted to help me. I used to joke that she was my barista. That became one of my afternoon delights, was to have a cup of coffee. And so she would come in and she'd go, "Is it barista time, Dad? Is it's barista time?" So she learned how to use the Keurig and to make me a cup of coffee in the afternoons, which I came to love. And she would come in and bring it to me. Sometimes she'd bring me a snack with it, and then she'd lay down and we'd talk. And that was a tremendous blessing.
Beautiful. What can you share about how your attitude towards life changed?
Yeah. I created a list when I was in the ER, and it's probably a little longer than we want to share here, but a couple big things. One of them I wrote is, life is a gift. Don't waste it. Don't waste the gift you've been given. And I think all of us are not all of us, but a lot of us are so busy just running from our day to day that we don't recognize how beautiful life is and what a great gift life truly is. We don't maybe always appreciate the people around us like we could or should. And, that really taught me. And honestly, it's something I'm trying to figure out now. Coming back to work is a blessing. My company has been tremendous and the team has been amazing and supportive, but it's a challenge, because it's like, okay, what am I supposed to really do with my life? I believe God saved me, and he saved me for a reason. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that reason is, and that's a struggle. I also learned, one other things from my list, so I won't go through all of them, but was,
you can, if you want to go through, I know you shared some things in advance, but if you want to go through them all, let's, you can rattle them off, and then I can ask you a couple of questions if you'd like.
Well, I think the little things are the big things is a huge one for me in life. I think we're always focused on, well, I got when's vacation coming, or when am I going to get this promotion, or, whatever in our life. And we miss what's really, really important. Like, a great example was sitting with my daughter and just relax. Like, that's a big thing, but it's a little thing too. You know what I mean? So it's focusing on, those little things in life and recognizing how important they are. My wife and I talk a lot about, my daughter's 12, and, it'll 5 years, 6 years, she'll be off to college. Like, that's not a long time, and it'll go fast. Right. And I'll be wishing for that time. And I also you'll never hear me complain again about being too busy with my kids' sports or my kids' activities. Like, when I was able to finally start going back to some of their games, it was like, I love this and I miss this so much. And I'd complain, geez, I got 3 games this weekend. I don't get to watch the game. I don't get to have a life for me. Right. I mean, you'll never hear those words out of my mouth again. And because I know that time is fleeting, and I almost lost it entirely. And so I appreciate every second of my kids' activities and being part of their life. Obviously, it's Halloween, so looking forward to going trick-or-treating with them tonight. And, I think some of those things at times I considered a burden, or, took me away from something else I wanted to do. But man, those are so important and such blessings in your life that when they're gone, you will miss them. So, try to enjoy them and be as present as you possibly can in those moments.
Why do you think people get that wrong? Because I know it seems like a lot of people that have sort of near-death experiences or different types of, I don't know, awakenings or like meaningful life lessons, whether that's going through a challenge or something very, very significant, but they seem to often come to that conclusion. And yet there's so many people that forget that, or at least don't operate with that, don't operate sort of in the world in a way that matches that, ultimately. So I'm wondering, like, why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, I think, you hear a lot about how, in America, especially, it's like almost like a badge of honor to be super, super busy, and you hear those conversations a lot from people, right? Like, well, I'm busy. Johnny's got this and Joni's doing this and I'm working 80 hours a week and, trying to, so I just think it's partially our culture in our society. I also think people just, and I was super guilty of it too. So certainly not throwing stones, but I think people just don't take time to slow down and don't take time to recognize the gift that life is. And I think major moments in your life, whether it's a parent dying or God forbid, hopefully never a child dying or you get seriously injured like I did, I think really it forces you. It doesn't, it's not an option just to think about those things. It forces you to think about those things. Whereas, if you don't, when you're not going through something like that, you don't have to slow down. You can just keep going and burn yourself out potentially, or just. So I think some of it's culture related.
Brad, what did you learn about yourself?
Yeah, I learned I'm a fighter. I learned I don't give up. I learned that I can get hit hard like cement truck and push through and keep going. I also learned at times I'm extremely weak and that, I really have to, there's a lot of things that say there's two voices in your head, one that tells you to go for it and one that tells you to back off and stay in your comfort zone. And that's a constant battle back and forth. Right. And I've really had to shut that voice down of that woe is me, but he won a few days, and then I learned that I really, really love my family, and that's what's most important to me. I have a list in my room that says my priorities in life, and it's faith, family, health, career, friends. And if I'm being honest with myself, before this accident, my life was not in that order. Career may have been listed fourth in my priority list that I write down, but in many ways it was number one. And, that's definitely not the case since then. So, I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about life. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. I'm still learning through this experience. And, as I reconnect into kind of society and into people, I'm constantly having conversations. And that's also been one of the cool things. Is kind of like, they say like people always say really nice things about you at your funeral. How come they don't say those things to you when you're alive? People have been saying those things to me. My Facebook feed has never been busier. People have reached out all kinds of different ways and told me how I impacted their lives. People from grade school, people I haven't thought of or talked to in 20 years have reached out and come out of the woodwork and supported us. And that's been cool, to have some conversations with people, because people kind of do look at me now as like, I'm going to tell this guy how I feel about him because he could be dead or he almost was dead, So that's also been a blessing that I think doesn't happen a lot in life either. Because a lot of times we wait to tell people how we feel about them until we tell their spouse or we tell somebody maybe at their wake or their funeral, which is kind of sad.
And what did you learn about? So we talked at the beginning about your interest in kind of life mission to be a servant leader. And throughout this experience, been forced to not serve, as you said, like in the example of being at home, but instead to be served. What did you learn from that difference in terms of how you show up?
Yeah, I'd much rather serve than be served. That's for sure. I'll tell you, I just, we went and served dinner to the firefighters who saved my life a couple weeks ago, and just sitting with those men and women and just listening to, their day to day and how they serve the community and how they put their life on the line every day. It's amazing to me. And same with the nurses and techs. I mean, some of the nurses I would develop really great relationships with, and I would go out of my way. I tried to, at least, to always thank them and tell them how much I appreciated them and how much I respected and appreciated their service to me. And there's some things they had to do for me that I, could imagine doing for someone else. And they have to do even worse things for other people. And I was amazed at how many nurses and nurse techs would tell me, like, how thank you. Not many people tell us that. In fact, the opposite in a lot of ways. People are grumpy and angry that they're in the hospital, right? And don't, focus on the service aspect. So I'll tell you that first responders, nurses, techs, doctors, if you know people who are in those professions or they're in your family, thank them. And, hopefully you really respect them, because they sacrifice a lot, to help others. And yeah, I definitely would rather serve than be served. And now I kind of feel it's like my mission, as I'm getting healthier and getting better, to really serve and to serve others. And I think telling my story is one form of service. So doing podcasts like this, and I'm talking to my church in a couple weeks at their Thanksgiving event, and just mainly just to say thank you and tell them how much I appreciate them, because they were instrumental in everything they did for my recovery. But yeah, I mean, service is what life's about. I really do believe that's why we're here. We're here to serve and help one another. And, people who live in these service professions, and, add teachers to that, add, daycare workers, and I'm probably leaving out a lot of professions that are really about service as well. So my apologies to those professions, but, service can be a life mission. And, I think most people would probably rather serve than be served, although there's some that would rather be served than serve.
Yeah, it seems like those people, by and large, don't consider their jobs just jobs. Like there's something beyond that. There's a mission behind it, a lot of times human kind of element to it, and a prioritization of people and things that go outside of yourself. Right. I think that's the essence of service. So wonderful, I think, takeaway from this conversation is, as you said, to kind of at a minimum, thank those people that are day in, day out, whether or not it's your accident or someone else's, showing up and serving, and not always getting the appropriate kind of recognition. And that goes beyond compensation, of course, too, but that's part of it. And so I think we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to those people. I co-sign that. So as we wrap up here, Brad, wanting to learn, I mentioned that, or at least I know you're involved in nonprofits. Are there any organizations in particular you'd like to give a shout out to?
Yeah. So there's two that I serve on the board of. One is Social Kitchen, which is a charity here in St. Louis focused on food insecurity and working to help others. They've served over 10,000 meals in the St. Louis area, and it's run by just an amazing man. His name is John Michelle. He's a retired brigadier general. If you get a chance, look up his TED Talk on YouTube about building an Air Force in Afghanistan. He's become a tremendous mentor of mine, and I am looking for more and more ways to serve his organization. We actually have an event in Ferguson, which many of your listeners may know that name. There was a lot of violence and issues in Ferguson years ago here in St. Louis, and it's a community that's still kind of has a lot of issues and challenges and poverty. And so Social Kitchen, great organization. And then children's cancer is a big one for me. I know it is for you as well. I've worn this bracelet now since 2015, 16, something like that, for a little girl in our family who battled cancer bravely for 6 years and unfortunately passed away at the age of 14, which is super sad. And so I was very involved with St. Jude's for a while, great organization, but joined the board of a charity here called the National Children's Cancer Society, which we kind of fill in the gap. We're not about treatment and those kinds of things. We're more about the expenses that families incur that you don't really think about and aren't really covered. So for example, hospital kit are, hotels for the family, while their child's in the hospital, lost wages, not being able to pay their mortgage because they're not able to work and they're focused on their child. So that's where our organization steps in to help those families in need and some of the expenses that aren't covered by insurance and aren't really covered by, other charitable organizations.
That sounds like both of them sound wonderful. And in particular, the National Children's Cancer Society sounds like, that's like an element of one's experience that you could only really know if you've gone through it, right? And like you have some perspective on that, but it makes perfect sense that those kinds of things would be super material. Like there's of course the patient that is rightfully the focus of many charities appropriately, but I think that, the parents and the family also significantly are sort of victims to the disease as well in terms of financial and other obligations. So appreciate you sharing that. And how can our audience get in touch with you? Where can we follow you?
Yeah, so I'm on all the social medias. I'm not super active on Twitter or Instagram, but I'm pretty active on Facebook. So I've posted a lot of things about my journey on Facebook, and that's kind of been my main vehicle to communicate, both me and my wife's main vehicle to communicate kind of how I'm progressing and some of the lessons learned and, shared meet with the firefighters and things like that. Also pretty active on LinkedIn for anybody in the business world who wants to link in with me. And then, my email address is just my name. It's Hermann, BHERMANN, spelled with 2 N's, 2004@gmail.com. And then for anybody who wants to contact me directly, happy to call or text me on my cell phone, which is 314-221-7877. So please reach out to me. I aim to help anybody who I can, or anybody who's, been through a similar situation that would like to talk through anything with me or just be an ear to listen. I'm happy to do so. So feel free to reach out to me through any of those vehicles.
Amazing. Your phone might be ringing off the hook. Might be walking that back and asking me to cut it. We'll see. I know that's super, super wonderful. Actually, that you're willing to support others in that way and allow them to contact you. So, Brad, this has been a really terrific conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your journey going through such a difficult time and really, the lessons that came out of it, not just for you, but for people that might be inspired to pay attention to those lessons and see if they resonate for them, to just at least consider them. So I appreciate your time and thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It's been an honor to be on your show, and look forward to continuing our